Hello, this is Subtext 002, The Utility and Limits of History, talking about Thomas Carlyle's On History and On History Again. Also going to be touching a little bit on his essay biography, but not the entirety of it or anything. I don't have much of a preamble planned out for this, so I think I'm just going to get right into it. Carlyle says that our social nature as humans is exemplified the most in man's delight for biography. And I work in a bookstore. I have been for 4 or 5 years now, and pound for pound, like the most common functional question I get is, where's your biography section? So that rings true to me, maybe a little bit more than for other people even, but man's inclination towards history is a sort of narcissism, I'd say. And I don't mean narcissism in a negative sense. Carlyle says that we're all indentured to live. We're condemned. We can't really help ourselves from having, a scientific, a poetic, and an instructive interest in these things. Because history is the, quote, only articulate communication between past and present. And then additionally, another quote, only he who understands what has been can know what should be and will be. So because we all have this, this is very platitudinal sounding, because we all have this life to live, and I'm sure I don't need to be the one to tell you that there's a lot of oddities involved and a lot of questions that we all have. It only makes sense for us to dig into our forebears and, see how they acted at the time and what they thought, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Carlyle says every mortal has this problem of existence set before him. The thing is that this narcissism kind of comes back in maybe not a super productive way, in that we kind of cast aside a lot of other things to just keep staring at ourselves in the puddle, more or less. The one he brings up is, quote, in terms of pure stature, think of the night sky, but who incessantly watches the sky? We constantly around us have so many natural things that we can go out and experience and examine, but more often than not, we'd rather spend our time in a in a bit more of a productive world, maybe reading history books, but a lot of the time it's more, watching Netflix, et cetera, et cetera. Going back to his, night sky example, it's like, think about the last time you went out at night just to see the sky. I know it's been a while for me. I used to go somewhat frequently, but I live in a city with a lot of light pollution now, so I don't even really think of it anymore. And, I spend all my time, doing this, for instance, as opposed to going out and experiencing that. It's all just it's a very human proclivity to have, to just be more interested in ourselves than the external natural world, right? An issue with that Carlyle talks about is that not only we ignore our external world, it's that people who have vested interests are the ones that end up trying to, the ones that it's that people with vested interests are the ones that end up going out and experiencing it the most, because this dates the piece to the 1830s, but who else goes out and stares at the sky every night but almanac writers? But they don't go out and do it just for the joy of it. They go out because they're trying to predict the weather, right? This inclination towards this kind of like narcissistic interest in history goes even deeper in the way that, Carlyle says, quote, even in the highest works of art, we can nowise forget the artist. We can't help but project the fact that they're human to take an interest in it. And the one he brings up is, think about Raphael's Transfiguration. I'm sure you've seen that at some point. But he says that if that painting were to have developed naturally as a pattern of moss or lichen on a big stone, no one would really care. And it's because the painter wasn't a man. Because these things don't emerge from us, we pay way less attention to them. So when it comes to art, we can't even just appreciate the art in itself. We're always having to dig into it more and understand where it came from, et cetera, et cetera. I'm sure you've done this. I know I do it a lot. The one I was thinking about is, Homer likely wasn't even a single figure, but we can't help but think of him as, just that blind poet in ancient Greece, Like we try to suss out the spirit of these people, and we can't help but project ourselves into them just to try to understand them. And when you think about art, like how much of art is pseudo-biographical or pseudo-historical in a way? Most of it, but not necessarily all of it, is engaged in some sort of narration. Or if it's not engaged in narration, it's maybe projecting some sort of feeling of the past that has resided inside the artist, right? What is a novel other than, a mimic biography of the character or characters or places or things involved in it, right? Every story that we create is like some sort of an attempt to understand our lot in life. We're all indentured to live, don't forget. And we want to gain some acquaintance with our fellow creatures, Carlyle says. But going even a bit further than that, like all books, and this is a quote, all books are to some extent historical documents. Think back to the last one of these I did on E.H. Carr. We talked about how every production of history betrays a sense of the era and the conditions that it was written in, because information is only able to be presented in the way that it can be in its cultural and social milieu of the time, right? To kind of dredge up an example from Carlyle's time, let's think about a technical manual on carpentry from the 1830s. The information in this manual is going to present a very much more rudimentary understanding of carpentry than we would have now. And the information is going to be presented in a very dated way, and it's going to have a lot of emphasis on things that we wouldn't have now. Like there's probably going to be a lot of discussion about wood that might not be super. There's going to be a lot of discussion on like different kinds of wood that we might not understand as having a lot of utility now, or we just kind of understand a bit better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So even when we're not explicitly engaged in looking into the biography of some artist or whoever, all information has some sort of like implicit historical character to it. Going even a little bit further, Carlyle says that the sum total that constitutes history is gossip, scandal, and egoism, which isn't wrong in any sense if you think about, a history. What is a history book if it was, stripped of all the gossip, scandal, and egoism, right? Carlyle says that history is our chief inheritance. We do nothing but enact history. It's the first distinct product of our spirit. Because there's never been a culture or a peoples that are primitive enough to have not tried to engage in historical representation in some way, even if they haven't gone so far as to conceptualize counting to 5, is the example he brings up. Quote, "History has been written with quipo threads, with feather pictures, with wampum belts, and still oftener with earth mounds and monumental stone heaps." Our current understanding of history is really slated towards the history book. But historical representation doesn't necessarily mean pages and a bound volume. It's, there's different ways to engage in that. Like think about even just like the earliest art, like the cave art in France. Am I to assume, are we to like really assume that isn't some sort of historical representation of something they thought was, worth remembering, right? Maybe I'm being presumptuous. I don't know. Another thing Carlyle says is, quote, "Our very speech is curiously historical." And I think this is worth thinking through. So if we think about what is the actual gross percentage, do you think, of how much our day-to-day communication is purely narrative based? You think about the typical water cooler conversations. I position my life in such a way that I have to have those as little as possible. But if you think about the typical water cooler conversation, and someone asks you, hey, Jim, what did you do this weekend? What you tell them, if you're Jim, is, a series of events that happened over your weekend that you've deemed significant enough to communicate. Even just when you're talking to someone, like most conversations are, oh, this thing happened to me once. I remembered thinking this is what I thought at the time. It's all reference to some sort of past, right? Like we tell stories to each other, and that's kind of not dissimilar from how we engage with narrative in art and whatnot. It's just the main crux of our communication is all based on narration. Anyways, what all knowledge is, according to Carlyle, is recorded experience. You think about the scientific method, you can't design some sort of an experiment with the intention of producing knowledge without reference to the antecedent information, right? This happened this way once before. Maybe if we shift it this way, it'll happen this way this time, and then then you try the experiment and you see what happens and you document it, right? So this is kind of all to say that, there's a great grand ubiquity of history, and we're kind of going to move on to what Carlyle is reacting to with writing these essays, and that's the contemporary view of history at his time. The contemporary view of history in Carlyle's time is maybe a little bit different than it is now for us. He says, history perhaps has never been understood higher in these times of ours. And that history as a subject's kind of been converged on by all the different disciplines. It's the one spot where everyone can kind of stop being sectarian and all sit down together is history. But the problem that Carlyle diagnoses is that history used to be our way to gratify our common appetite for the wonderful, but now it's become the instructor in gratifying. And what he's saying is that, it's become, the ends has become the means. And, there's a lot worse things, especially now, that people could be invested in. But when that happens, and people stop having a critical understanding of it, there's, a lot of issues with it. As you know, with history, we're consistently on pretty shaky territory. Most of the last episode was on that, the contingencies of it and the production of it. And there's a lot of things to work through with historiography. And he goes out of his way to say that he doesn't want to poke too many holes, and the value of it as a subject. It's not to denigrate it, but, to have a positive critique of it. As a lot of the issues with regard to history are kind of not even being acknowledged in his time. There's a lot of, issues with documentation and epistemic shit that's, just kind of going completely unanswered, or that's just kind of going completely unnoticed. He focuses in on this exhortation, this phrase, quote, examine history for it is philosophy teaching by experience. And we're going to kind of frame the rest of our discussion with that quote as well. Before history can teach by experience, the philosophy kind of has to be ready at hand. But what exactly is what are the requisites of that? And it's that experience must be gathered and intelligibly recorded, which is completely reasonable, but it's exactly where we kind of start getting into the weeds. So we're going to enter into the critique portion of this, talking about the Battle of Marathon. That's something that we all remember. It's been selected as a capital H, capital E historical event over the centuries. The great battle where the Greeks routed the Persians into the sea. But what Carlyle says is that, think about all the thousands of other battles that have passed from memory. And then by extension, think of all the endless amounts of people involved in each of them. Being that there's so many things that we just don't know, can we ever truly know who or what the decisive factors were in each of the ones that we do remember? what's to say that we even, remember the proper ones? Like, who's to say that, or who's even to say that we kept track of everything worthy of recording, right? The complication in this is that this kind of exists on an exponential curve, like these problems, because this extends to all aspects of life, not only, the outward conditions, what happened and who did it, but the inward as well, like what they were thinking, So think about your own life. How many ambiguities would you say that there are in your own personal history? And then scale that up exponentially to everyone that's ever lived. How many things have happened to you where you're not, entirely sure what actually happened? And even sometimes your own motivations can be pretty opaque to you. So Carlyle says that not only we know not, but also that we cannot know most of these things. Like there's a big epistemic gap right at the very core of history. Going even a bit further, he says that, quote, we may well say that of our history, the more important part is lost without recovery. So it's not only that the minor things that have probably passed or will never be recovered, it's that even the important ones are probably long. Even the important ones past a certain point are likely long gone. Contrary to E.H. Carr quoting Acton in the last one, absolute history is kind of out of our hands. Carlyle says the man required for that is unknown. It's not something that a non-mythological being would be able to attain. So if history is philosophy teaching by experience, it would require this a technical term, all knowledge, which is a very Germanic thing of him to say. But so the historian in that case can't present absolute history. He can only aim at some of the picture. Right, he can only represent some of this, but that shouldn't dampen our esteem for history, because we're still just doing our best at the end of the day, really. In the other essay, he says that history is, quote, the only articulate communication between past and present, but also that, quote, our letter of instruction comes to us in the saddest state, but only a shred of it remains in existence. So not only are there massive gaps of unknowable things, the things that do come to us are still in a pretty ragged state. So this kind of brings us to the second part of the critique, in that, flattening being into documents, the things that we can track, can we even accurately record them? Do we accurately record them? And the quote goes, the old story of Sir Walter Raleigh's looking from his prison window on some street tumult, which afterward 3 witnesses reported in 3 different ways, himself differing from all, is still a true lesson to us. Consider how it is that historical documents and records originate, even honest records, where the reporters were unbiased by personal regard, a case which, were noting more wanted, must ever be among the rarest. The real leading features of a historical transaction, whose movements that essentially characterize it, and alone deserve to be recorded, are nowise the foremost to be noted. At first, among the various witnesses who are also parties interested, there is only vague wonder and fear of hope, and the noise of rumor's thousand tongues. Till after a season the conflict of testimonies has subsided into some general issue, and then it is settled by a majority of votes, that such and such a crossing of the Rubicon, an impeachment of Strafford, a convocation of the notables are epochs in world's history, cardinal points on which grand world revolutions have hinged. Suppose, however, that the majority of votes was all wrong, that the real cardinal points lay far deeper, and had been passed over unnoticed, because no seer, but only mere onlookers chanced to be there. So we go through a lot of things here relatively quick. Starting with, Raleigh looking out from his prison cell and writing an account that is completely different from the 3 other people that saw it. This is the basis of our documents. We talked about documentation a bit on the last one about, the processing of facts, etc. So even when people are well-intentioned, we're not going to get the same story out of everybody, right? And the problem is that, we're trying to flatten a four-dimensional, let's just say we're trying to flatten a four-dimensional object onto a 2D surface. Carlyle says that the most gifted man can only observe and record the series of his own impressions, while often the things were done simultaneously. So things don't happen sequentially, really. They kind of all happen at once, and they're all kind of interconnected as well. So the map is not the territory, right? And then, being that all events in like our big messy web of everything are all kind of connected with one another, it's kind of hard to actually flatten that out. Carlyle calls it the chaos of being. Supposedly this is what the historian is depicting. With a through line through which all of this makes sense. What we actually end up with is a plausible scheme and theory of the transaction at hand. Another quote, "In this chaos, boundless as the habitation and duration of man, unfathomable as the soul and destiny of man, is what the historian will depict, and scientifically gauge, we may say, by threading it with a single lines of a few ells in length." Again, back to what we said previously, absolute history is not possible for us. It requires superhuman capabilities that only a god would have. But that still doesn't remove the utility of history from us. All of this is to say that this is the basis that we're working with. That's kind of going completely unacknowledged by people in Carlyle's time. I don't think it's any different to now either. This is what we're supposed to be reading, because it's philosophy teaching by experience, and there's a whole lot of contingencies involved. And then this moves into where Carlyle starts critiquing historians themselves. Carlyle makes a delineation between the artisans and the artists. And if you've ever spoken to me about art or whatever, you'll have likely heard me drone on about a pretty similar distinction that I make between, real art. Like most musicians I know are not artists. Like blues dad lawyers are not artists. Those are musicians. Because there's a very distinct lack of like a transcendental quality to a lot of things people are doing. And that doesn't mean that there isn't room for a lot of that stuff, but it makes a lot of it quite boring and maybe doesn't really have a lot of like resonant qualities for me and most people as well. And I don't think there's always like a hard line between these two. I think people slip back and forth, of course. But anyways, Carlyle distinguishes between these two and the way a historian can work profitably for himself as a simple husbandman of the earth. A farmer, at least at the time of his writing, could realistically make quite a profitable life for himself merely, knowing how to tend to his crops and work the earth. He doesn't need to know about those central fires or the great mysteries. It's a very Protestant way to live, but he has his expertise and that's what he does. The issue arises when this simple husbandman of the earth takes the knowledge he has of this like very narrow field and begins like applying and creating laws to other things. All it really does is kind of obfuscate the reality at hand. When the historian is lacking this eye towards the whole, or this transcendental quality that I mentioned as well, it's not very useful for anyone. Like these understandings, if you have like a hyper specific, and I'm sure you've seen this a million times online. You can pretty much find like a million people doing this on Twitter on any given day, of just like people that are like highly specialized in some whatever fucking tech field. And then they kind of start trying to, do the EAC thing where you're creating philosophy from first principles, etc. It's all very dreary and fucking stupid, frankly. Anyways, when Carlyle brings up political historians, is who he goes after first here. He says, one of the main threads of history up to a certain point is that almost all of the historical work up to a certain point because one of the main threads of history up to a certain point is that, all history was kind of political history. And, this is all very important, but it doesn't exactly, capture the entirety of human existence, As things like things happen outside of Congress, right? History doesn't rest on, the designs and the machinations and plans enacted by politicians against each other, Carlyle says that this very kind of drab, pedantic, Machiavellian maneuvering of, low-level and mid-level bureaucrats against each other isn't really where history happens. He says it belongs more to the realm of the gazetteer than it does the historian. He said, quote, "Far away from the Senate houses and antechambers, thought and action still occur." And he has a similar critique for the ecclesiastical historian, which he says theoretically should be more important and encompassing than the political historian, as it deals with, and I quote, "the need to understand how man's moral well-being had been and might to be promoted, the degree of moral elevation you can acquire by means of its instructions." But in reality, what happens with church history is similar to exactly what happens in political history. It's written in such a way that you would think that, history of the church lays in the bishops' chapter houses and not in the hearts of believing men. And there's a bit of an inversion here, because in the same way, there's so much more going on externally than what the political historians, focus on. There's a lot more happening. There's things that are entirely neglected. There's an internal world that's entirely neglected by the church historians, right? So we're stuck with the fact that even the history that should deal with the whole of existence is essentially caught up in the same nonsense politicking as the other things, and focusing on the outward mechanism and schisms and blah, blah, blah. And forgive me for sounding like a little Hegelian, quite regrettable, but, what exactly does church politicking tell us about the conditions of spirit over the course of the centuries? He even goes so far as to say, the history of philosophy should be under the jurisdiction of church history, if you think about it. And a proper history of poetry, quote, would depict the successive revelations which man had attained through the spirit of nature. But none of that is what's happening, and none of that's what happened then, none of that's what's happening now. But he says, let us keep the ideal of it forever in our eye. We've went through how the nature of our being is historical at its very root. And we've went through how the terrain that we're standing on with regard to history is a lot shakier than a lot of people would have you think. Or maybe not even have you think, but just would ever think about themselves. But none of this, again, is to denigrate the state of history. Carlyle says that if no complete history is to be gathered, understanding that we have a small portion that is still to be interpreted is enough. Because regardless of what we actually get, it's even in its tattered state, it is still the letter from our forebears, right? It's still all the information that they at least thought was worth getting through to us in the future. And the main thing to remember that never was apparent to me until I read this essay was that even with the idea that there is undoubtedly a lot of things that we forget and a lot of things that we don't know about, we ultimately and unavoidably still live in the consequence of those things that have happened that we've forgotten about. The causes will always be, complete or somewhat of a mystery to us, but that doesn't change the fact of the day-to-day that those events still happened and still shape our world regardless of them being known to us, right? Just because we've forgotten about something doesn't mean that it didn't happen. Just because we are unaware of it doesn't mean we don't perpetually live in the shadow of it. Carlyle says that perfection is not the lot of man. To know all is not our concern. So what we have to do is just make do with what we have. And that's all we can really do. Again, I feel like a little bit iffy about the fact that my first two episodes of this have been completely decimating a lot of the epistemological standpoints of history, and I don't. Yeah, I'm reconciling with that a lot, and I'm hoping to maybe move in more productive directions soon. But with that, though, we are going to end on an encouraging quote from Carlyle. He says, quote, "Let all men explore it as the true fountain of knowledge, though the whole meaning lies beyond our ken." I'd like to thank you for questionably spending your time with me listening to Subtext 002. I think this was better than the first one. I'm feeling a bit better about it. I think it ended pretty inconclusively, but I don't know. It's baby steps all the way. I'm still deciding what 003 is going to be on. It might be on Nietzsche or Barbara Tuchman or something completely off the wall. But anyways, I'll see you then.